go. This is my very first nature journal, so this might be kind of embarrassing. Bear with me. But there's a lot that we can learn from our old journals, and sometimes it's nice to see where people started off. So this journal I started in February of 2014. It was my first Stillman and Burns sketchbook. This is the beta series, so it's 270 GSM, which is pretty heavy. Pretty much watercolor paper, and I was using micron pens, and I had just gotten a watercolor palette from John Muir Laws. And on the very first page I have a bunch of note taking, and I went to John Muir Laws gave a talk up at the Sonoma Veterans Building, and he gave the talk to a group of birders there, and it was called Thinking Like a Naturalist. So you can see here that I was doing note taking, and his slideshows have a lot of photos, so I was doing some sketching, and you can see that my bird sketches are pretty rudimentary at that time. But this was also when I very first learned about the idea of I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, and the importance of verbalizing your questions and your observations out loud. On the next page, and I think at this point I had already had Jack's book on drawing birds, and I was also using this gray Pentel brush pen, and I did some sketches during his talk there, and that was just a really fun talk, and I had to drive a lot to get to that talk, but still was good practice. And then at this time in my nature journal, I was also doing a lot of mixed media. You can see this ink work here, and I was doing a lot of these brainstorming and sort of lists, which is something that I don't do in my nature journal as much anymore. I also incorporated a lot more drawings such as this back then, and I was experimenting with watercolor for the first time, and you can see that I was taking some more risks and doing some stuff that I don't do as much in my nature journal these days. Some of this is note taking from books I was reading, and here's even a design for a ring. This is a ring, a turquoise ring that I saw in a dream that I had. So it's just interesting sometimes to think about what we use our nature journal for. And at this time, I really was doing a lot of different stuff in there. I was living with a family that had a kid. So here's an example of me not being precious in my nature journal. This, even though that this paper is expensive and stuff, I was letting the little 5-year-old girl draw in my sketchbook, and we did some drawings together. She had this really funny way of drawing rabbits, and so you can see some of these drawings we did collaboratively, and that was really fun. And also just not being precious, what I realized looking back at this journal is that I took a lot more risks. I experimented with different media. I was really into tracking. So I was drawing tracks and thinking about stuff and putting a lot of my ideas. So using my journal as sort of like a bouncing board for ideas, which I think is something that we should do even if we are considering it a nature journal. So here's another page where I did some brainstorming. This is for a graphic novel that I wanted to do at the time about Urashima Taro, who is a character from a Japanese legend, and I wanted to create a graphic novel based on that character and talk about the depletion of the ocean fisheries and have sort of a Rip Van Winkle plot mixed in, because in Urashima Taro there's a major like time jump type thing that's central to the plot. You can see here I was being very experimental and trying a lot of different stuff with the media that I was using, graphite, and see here I'm writing down the name. I'm using a water-soluble graphite pencil here and testing another one over here, and comparing those two watercolor pencils. Also down here I have this weird drawing of like I guess that's like a Sasquatch there. On this page, this is more stuff. This is based on some Japanese architectural stuff, thinking about that Urashima Taro story. You can see I was doing more nature journaling type stuff, drawing lichens, and you can see this is the way I used to draw a lot of natural subjects, is very detailed and very faint. This is at a time when I was very perfectionist with my drawing, or that's what my background had been, and very light. So pencil, I think I was afraid of making mistakes. Here I was experimenting a little bit with, this is almost like a landscapito drawn with water soluble pen and a brush pen. This was also when I first started experimenting with brush pens, and I think this is also when I first got a shoulder bag for nature journaling. So all of those were influences that John Muir Laws had on me, because at this point I had just applied for the graduate program in science illustration at CSU Monterey Bay. And I had emailed a bunch of the alumni from the program, and Jack was one of the ones that responded. So I was getting a lot of influence from him at this time. Here you can see a sort of attempt at a bit of a mapping, and this I'm realizing is something that lately I would like to do more of. And it's a very loose sort of landscape sketch with sort of this information about what's going on in these different locations. So what the plants are growing in those different areas, and just some ideas about them. So I think that's kind of something cool that I could learn from looking at this old journal and maybe apply to my new journal. Um, Here's some assignment ideas that I came up with, and then here's some sketches that I did based on a graphic novel, Japanese graphic novel that I was reading, and then here more of this nature journaling, and in this way, just kind of this big landscape, so very different from the way that I recommend people do it now. This is definitely not a landscapito, but then just showing that this is a major corridor for animals. This particular saddle right here was a spot on this property where a lot of animals came through. And I was living in a very remote place in Northern California at this time when I started this nature journaling project. But I got really into just the idea of sketching and nature journaling all the time. So I had this sketchbook with me all the time. Here is an example when I had to go to the mechanics. So I did have to go into town, and you can see I'm drawing everything. I'm drawing power lines. I'm drawing like dead trees and cattails and cars outside of old buildings. So it's just interesting for me to look at this right now, because now I limit my subject matter a lot more, and it's just interesting to realize that I haven't always done that, and that I've gone through some stages with that. Here's an example of where I was nature journaling with, I was going on a lot of these tracking classes. So you can see here that I'm drawing animal tracks and the ground, which is often a challenging subject to sketch. Here's some twinberry flowers, and I'm note taking as well. So while I'm drawing these tracks, I'm note taking, and I'm also drawing the people there. So you can see I don't really have a good landscapito approach, and I'm kind of filling the page with these landscapes, which in some ways aren't that effective, but I'm also including a lot more sketches of people in my classes than what I'm doing now, and I think that's something useful, and I think getting back into drawing these tracks more would also be useful for me. Here's more from that same tracking class. This was a frog and some more tracks. More experiments with watercolor and sort of brainstorming about, I was really interested in graphic novel techniques at this time and comic techniques. Here I spent a couple hours in a parking lot looking at this ponderosa pine and looking at the bark and trying to depict that in different ways. And you can see I'm using a nature journaling approach where I'm not just drawing things, but asking lots of questions about how to draw it and what's going on with this pattern. And you can see my main tool is graphite, which is useful for the values here and the cracks, but for the writing, it can be a problem. As you can see, it's unreadable to the camera. And then here's another page drawing some trees and lichens, and you can see that my watercolor is still pretty weak. I'm not controlling the values very well. And so here, for example, this blue is of the sky is as dark as this rock, and that's something that is not really correct, and that could be improved. And I think I've gotten somewhat better with that. Here is some nature journaling I did of this new growth on these plants, and I think this was poison oak. Yeah, so I was nature journaling poison oak right here. the new growth and the flowers, and a very good, I think, nature journaling approach. I'm doing these test colors because I'm really getting to learn my colors, but you can see my control of darkness is not that great, and that my text being in graphite makes it quite a bit harder to read. But I'm definitely learning, and I think this might be my very first landscapito. So it looks like I pushed the values a little bit more here, but you can see this background slope here ends up being darker and sort of taking away from the sense of depth, and I don't have atmospheric perspective, and this sky is way too blue. I was probably focused on getting the color of the sky too much and not the value. The manzanita branches look all right, but this is probably my very first landscapito. Yay! I was also really into archery at this time, and so that was one of my main practices. And I was doing just all of my personal mindset journaling in here. At this time in 2014, I didn't have like a practice the way that I do now, a very structured practice. And I would just kind of do more of a stream of consciousness diary style of journaling. Here's another trip into town, and you can see I am just sketching everything, and even like stuff in the window of a photography store. I don't have a really good metadata system, and my text is kind of messy and hard to read, and haven't really developed that yet. Still working with graphite, but one cool thing is that I'm drawing everything. This was another. I think this was during a while my car was getting worked on. I just walked down the street and found this little creek. You can see these ducks that I was drawing and observing there, and some palm trees. Cool perspective. I still really like drawing palm trees. My drawings are okay, and this choice of perspective I think is actually very interesting. But I'm really struggling with how to use the color blue in the sky. And the main problem is the value. So as you can see, the value of the sky should always, the rule of thumb is that the value of the sky, it should be the lightest value in the entire drawing. And you can see here that the main stalk of these palm trees doesn't stand out. Now this background back here, that stands out from the sky, and it's partly because the sky gets paler as it comes down here, but I was too focused on getting the color of the sky and I messed up the value. So that's something to remember is with watercolor in particular, trying to not overdo the sky by putting in blue is really important to come up with convincing landscapes. All right, let's see. And this is a really good example of how bad I was at drawing animals, especially gesture drawing. So the family that I was living with, the little kid had a pet rat, or two pet rats, and I was trying to sketch them while she was playing with them. And you can see these rat faces and rat shapes. I was trying to break down the shapes, and at least I'm trying. And I think that's the important thing, is that I was trying. I'm also trying different sizes, and it looks pretty bad, but that's how you learn. I was also really drawing everything, urban things too. So you can see I spent quite a bit of time drawing this power line, and then really getting into like what's going on here with the shadows. So my mind was definitely very inquisitive, and I was trying to draw all the time. And that's something that I think I'm going to try to take away from this, is especially during these crazy pandemic times where you might be stuck at home, you might not be able to get into the nature journaling grooves that you want to, or that you think are the way it should be. So try to just draw everything, and use your journal for a lot of different things. Here's a terrible sketch of the little girl, a little girl holding her rat, and I mean I obviously totally botched her face, but this plant looked really good. So see, it's possible to have an experience like this and then be like, I'm never going to try to draw a person again. But the thing to remember is that drawing faces compared to drawing trees is a totally different thing. So you can't compare yourself and then decide, oh, I'm just better at drawing trees. Well, part of the problem is that like 70% of your visual cortex is dedicated to like facial recognition. So every single person is an expert at looking at faces, but not everybody's an expert at looking at trees. So there's a lot more leeway when you draw a tree for whether it'll look realistic or not. But human faces, if you mess it up even a little bit, everybody's going to know. And so that's an important thing to recognize and not blame it all on yourself. More plant sketches down here, and I was doing a lot of these color swatches, which is fun. Some ideas for graphic novel, comic book type thing. Here I'm experimenting with media more, and I'm also copying other people's drawing styles. So I'm looking at this Olaus Muriel's style of drawing tracks with ink and copying that and experimenting with that. Now you can see I don't have the best system for dividing the page. Haven't learned about grid theory yet. And my boxes I am using boxes, but they're not really, I would say they're not as developed as the ways that I know how to divide my page now. So you can see the way this page is divided is kind of messy, but I'm experimenting with silhouettes. I'm drawing the same subject over and over again and zooming in, zooming out, and I'm experimenting with a lot of different media. So all of those things are great. You can still see where I have a lot to learn. So a couple more sort of attempts at landscapitos. This is a ship near Santa Cruz, some trees near Santa Cruz. This isn't a good example of biting off something that's too big and then not really being able to get in, develop it very much. More some bark studies, more ink work. Some of this is pretty fun. Definitely a different style than I have now. Here's a cool example of an action event that I witnessed, and this was an accipiter. I'm not sure if it was a sharpshin or a Cooper's hawk that caught a pigeon in my friend's backyard where I was staying. And you can see I barely got any drawings of it, but then I tried to write about the whole series of events, and by writing it down, at least I captured it in my nature journal. These are the type of events that we often witness and just decide, oh, I can't nature journal that, and we just let it go. If you at least write down the sequence of events, that will capture that in your record. Now here's an example of, this was a really fun moment. My friends were all drinking beer and just talking about stuff that I wasn't interested in, and it was near Santa Barbara, and there was a light outside with all these moths coming to it. So I decided that instead of sitting around talking, drinking beer, I was going to nature journal these moths, and it was really fun, and I think I got some pretty good sketches. Here's like a sketch showing like what it looked like on the wall there, and some of the bugs that were coming, including some wasps. And so I think this page is an example of sometimes you're going to have these experiences where something will come out looking really good, and this is a good moment to remind yourself, or just to know that sometimes the subject matter or sometimes certain accidents will happen in your favor that make that page look really good. And it might not be something, you can't really take credit for all of that sometimes. So don't let yourself get too focused on those moments, because on the flip side, there's going to be times when the drawings don't come out good and the things don't look right, and it's also not your fault. You can't take credit. So sometimes just recognizing there's certain subject matters and certain situations that are going to make your drawings look better, and it's not always, you can't always take credit for that. In 2014, I got to go to this really cool event that I would have been at this week, a primitive skills event, where you can learn about all kinds of different things, including like making fire with sticks, tanning deer hides, making stone tools, all that kind of stuff, making cordage. And I was nature journaling during that whole thing. So for example, someone was tanning this fox hide, so I decided to try to draw it. It was a challenging subject, and I tried drawing all kinds of different things that these days I don't really nature journal. Here's another thing you can see. I tried to sketch this scrub jay, and look how bad that is. So when you're first learning something like birds, I had spent time looking at birds, but I had not really spent very much time drawing birds yet. And so what happens is you when you're first trying to draw something that you haven't studied before, your drawings are going to come out like a cartoon version of that animal that you have in your head, and that's normal, and it's just going to take time and observation. Now also look at this sky. recognize the problem going on there that I've been talking about already? So this was a really fun thing. I got to watch this mule packing workshop where this guy was showing how they load up pack mules for trips to the Grand Canyon and stuff like that. So they were showing all the knots and these different pouches and how they carry the material. So all of these cool straps and stuff like that. And so this was a really fun thing to apply like a sketch noting or nature journaling approach to that. Here are some good examples of things that I was experimenting with. I was experimenting with more watercolor pencils at that time. I'm experimenting with more pen, how to take notes during primitive skills classes. So this guy was teaching a class on how to make friction fire with sticks in a style like the Bushmen in South Africa and Namibia use, and I tried to sketch that and process that. So one thing that you can do during a pandemic time or during regular time is you can use your nature journaling approach and apply it to other things. Like maybe you're cooking with your kids. Can you apply a nature journaling approach to that and learn more and be more curious and ask better questions? I think you can apply nature journaling to everything. Here's a couple examples of me trying to do landscapes, and you can see I'm not using any framing techniques. I basically just split the page in two. I know I wasn't doing this or like cropping or making like intentional choices about any of that. All things that if you've watched my landscape painting videos, you know that those are mistakes, and I'm making those mistakes here. You can also see here I was adding a lot of detail into the background. See all that ink work back there? Those hills no longer recede. In fact, those hills come forward in front of these bushes here and these trees here, which are actually closer. So see how there's not very much depth in this drawing. This one, on the other hand, has a little bit more. I didn't use the ink, but I also did develop these colors back here a little bit too much, and that brings them into the foreground. See how this darkness here brings that into the foreground more than it should. This is probably a good choice in terms of subject though, because see this road right here? That creates that effect I told you of receding into the distance, which can be really beneficial. Right, here's a couple more examples of me trying to do landscapitos that are sort of failing. You can see this is what Jack would call anemic watercolor. So see how pale that is? Part of the problem is that I'm nature journaling in the sun and it was very bright. And so then when you come inside after that, you realize, oh my gosh, this is way too faint and not pushing the values anywhere near enough. See, the sky is probably a good value, but everything else here needs to be way darker. And this is a common problem when you're first starting out with watercolor. Now here's a really good example of what not to do. This was a beautiful scene that I wanted to paint. There's like a cool path and this tree coming over, and I probably spent like 40 minutes or more sketching it in, but can you even see this? Especially if I hold it back here. No, you can't. And so I definitely did not get the values. This is a super anemic watercolor, and the other big problem is I bit off more than I could chew. If I had done a landscapito and been more disciplined about cropping and making a painting like 1/10 of this size, I would have been able to complete it and push the values, or I would have learned my mistake and maybe learned how to improve it in the next couple of attempts. I probably could have done 4 landscapitos in the time it took me to do this full page spread. So there's times when doing a full page spread might be worth it or might be interesting, but for the most part, I think you'll be much better off if you do landscapitos. So doing a full page landscape spread is not recommended. I want to get into these notes, but I think I'm going to have to do it in another video. These are some notes I took about a book that an audiobook I was listening to. Super cool neuroscience, but I'm going to have to get into that in a different video. And then let's see, that's pretty much the last page. Here's one of a fence lizard. I saw a fence lizard close up, and you can see this is exactly the type of drawing that you could, after drawing this, you could be really sad and just say I suck at drawing lizards, or you could just keep trying because there's certain shapes and certain angles that are challenging, like I said. So this is the opposite of those moths. This is something that was hard, and getting it right and getting the scales right takes time and takes practice. So Don't expect to have perfect drawings all the time, and understand that there's certain subjects that are going to be more challenging. So this is the paper that I use. You can see here, Stillman and Byrne Beta series, natural right, rough surface, 270 GSM. So that's that sketchbook share, and I'm going to be doing some more videos soon to help you nature journal at home during these crazy times. Next week, I'm going to do a whole video about nature journaling ideas that you can do with kids or with adults while you're stuck at home. So I hope that video helped you. If you can't wait all the way until next week for the next episode of the show, check out these two videos here. Bye.